Central banks played a major role in preventing collapse in the wake of the global economic crisis, and now many governments are ceding macroeconomic policy authority to their central banks. Is this sustainable? If so, should central bankers actively coordinate policies? And is that even possible without compromising individual objectives? An expert panel addressed these challenging questions during the second annual Swiss Day event, providing the focus for this edition of Rewind.
The subject of today's discussion revolves around the role of central banks in the global economy. This topic is not only important in a global context, but also on a national level. Are central banks encouraging a Keynesian deficit spending policy by pushing down interest rates with all the other elements that usually a Keynesian deficit spending policy entails? And what broader vision of economic policies do they have? These are the kind of questions I'm asking myself very often.
Switzerland, as you know, is a unique place. It's in many ways, but in one very specific way, it's a small, open economy with a safe haven currency. There is no other such thing in the world. Safe haven currency with a small, open economy. The fear of deflation is understandable, but deflationary cycles or deflationary spirals are exceptional. And low inflation is often either the result of outside forces, such as the current fall in oil and commodity prices, something that is better to look through, or it may be the symptom of a more profound economic malaise that is not of monetary origin. Low inflation in and of itself is not the source of additional welfare losses. In fact, it opens a window of opportunity for central banks. It typically means that they will be able to remain accommodating for a longer period of time. That is, it pushes further into the future the date at which they will have to step on the brakes.
One of the reasons why it's such a tricky territory for central banks in so many countries right now is because unconventional measures, expanding your balance sheet to 2, 3, 4, 5 times what it was before, bailing out failed institutions and so forth, all of these unconventional and crisis-related measures that we've seen in the last several years have immense distributional consequences. I think the crisis has raised some uncomfortable questions about whether we may have gone overboard in the generation before the crisis in giving central banks too much independence and in some places insufficient accountability. Yes, central banks, when they work well, they work very well, and they can help solve problems that fiscal authorities and elected officials may not be able to solve. However, when they are in challenging situations and when they have to operate in the gray area of their mandates, which some central banks have done in the last several years, then we do have issues of democratic accountability.
So for 27 years, I taught my students that central banks and monetary policy can only affect nominal variables like inflation, not real variables like economic growth, employment, etc. in the long run. But there's an intriguing new view of monetary policy today that says there are circumstances in which monetary policy can have real effects, and it's very important. You know, most central banks emphasize core inflation, deviations of core inflation from their objective, to guide them in not reacting to some of these supply shocks. But we found out now that core inflation itself is not a good measure of the underlying rate. It's affected by the exchange rate and the spillover from oil.
Jean-Pierre writes in his paper that it's very unfortunate that central banks have, in many sense, become leaders rather than followers. And I agree. But I'm not sure that we've reached the right conclusions. I mean, many people believe that it has been complicit in irresponsible fiscal policy. Now, that may be true, but then when you ask them further, they don't agree on what irresponsible fiscal policy is, because on one side it's because they've been complicit in fiscal policy being too loose, and the other side is that it's been too tight. They also believe that the Fed's interventions during the crisis represent an overreach, again, into an area that was probably the domain of other political decisions. And I think the fundamental failing behind those who want central banks to follow rules is a belief that there are rules that somehow do not involve discretion and the judgment of human beings. All systems, including all rules-based systems, require discretion, including those whose proponents claim to are actually rules-based. And in fact, having many of these systems in place would actually make matters worse by following central banks to follow rules long past their useful life that produce very bad situations for the economy that then they're then forced to abandon in a very ad hoc way. So, in sum, central banks cannot save the world, but they can do a lot to make it better than it otherwise would be, and they should be given the discretion to do so.
For more information, visit wilsoncenter.org. Click the Research tab and search under the Global Europe program.